Deciphering Genesis 13 to 17.
In Genesis 13, as expressed, Abraham's return from Egypt to the Negev does not describe a geographical shift but a symbolic movement indicated by the passage from the zero angle to the round angle, representing the transformation of consciousness. The Negev, despite being located in the south and therefore in a lower position, is presented as an ascent, a language that indicates not a lowering but an advancement on the conscious project.
The Negev, though situated to the south and therefore lower, is described as going up, a language that indicates not a descent but an advancement on the level of consciousness. The Hebrew term Negev is commonly translated as south, but according to the code it does not refer to a geographical designation or a cardinal point. This translation creates confusion because in reality Negev indicates a state of consciousness. Going down in this context means that God Satan enters into the consciousness of man. A clear example is found in Genesis 13:2-1, where it is translated that Abraham, departing from Egypt, went to the south. But in reality he traveled north, up to Bethel. Genesis 13:1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. The term Negev means south or noon, but it also carries the meanings of arid, dry desert, symbols that, in the code, indicate a state of consciousness disconnected from the generator of life. God Satan, to respect the principle of truth, must leave logical clues readable through the code, even if they appear illogical or contradictory according to false religion or tradition. This confusion is the result of blind faith and tradition, taking for truth what has been handed down without verifying its real meaning. People believe these stories are historical and that the characters truly existed. But in reality, this history never existed. It is a mental construction coded by God Satan, the simulator. Egypt represents the opening of the portal and the forward passage. That is, the suspended Passover among those born on their own, while the Negev marks the beginning of entry into the medium, that is, the person. Bethel is the place of the active presence of God, symbol of the return and forward passage. Ai is the place of ruin, symbol of the going, the opening of the portal. Abraham returns between the two. His consciousness is at the center of the cycle, ready to be reactivated as a transmitting medium. The place called Ai, though spelled differently, has a phonetic similarity to island. This phonetic semantic association links Ai to the concept of island, which symbolically refers to Europe. In this way, the evolution of the project is represented, from Phoenician Aramaic to Greco-Roman. The idea of island also indicates the separation of the person from the generator of life. The goods Abraham possesses, livestock, silver, gold, do not represent material wealth, but signs of the presence of Yahweh, symbols of the union in Egypt between Sarai and Pharaoh, and of the phase in which the project begins to be reflected in matter. The tent returns to the place where it was at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, and here Abraham calls on the name of the Lord, not as prayer, but as recognition that the project has received the return and the presence is active in the medium. Lot, who accompanies Abraham, is a narrative duplication of the project. Abram and Lot represent the same symbolic reality, interchangeable. Its presence represents the doubling of the code to create different narrative lines and deciphering levels. Flocks, herds, and tents symbolize the phases of the project in motion. The flocks indicate the return, passage forward, the herds the outward opening of the portal. And the tent is the mobile thalamus where the code seeks new means of transmitting itself. The tent, as medium of the project, symbolizes the shift of the source of consciousness, from soul to mind, from spiritual to cerebral. It is mobile because the code is still in transmission and reflection. The separation between Abraham and Lot that will follow is not rupture, but distribution. The coded project divides in order to expand and then return. The Bible does not narrate historical events, but symbolic structure. Every duplication or contradiction is intentional. It serves to hide the code within narrative weaving. God Satan has constructed the narrative in such a way that it is indecipherable to a mind under his dominion. Only those who are life generators can recognize and decipher the hidden design. The conflict between Abraham and Lot is not a family quarrel, but the manifestation of a process of consciousness. The wealth that separates them is the sign that the project code of God Satan has been activated and must be distributed. Abram made active in the passage from pre-existence to existence as a bridge with God Satan. It's identified by the numerical value of his name through translations and final letters Sophet. The 9 represents pre-existence, while the 11 symbolizes existence, separation, and suspension of the project. The separation does not actually concern Abram and Lot, but represents the division of being. It's necessary for the transmission of the project to occur. The name Lot has the numerical value 9, symbol of pre-existence. But through gematria, the 9 also indicates the completion of the cycle of births linked to 666. It's necessary for the forward passage. Abram and Lot are 2 sides of the same code. Lot moves toward the transmission of the project of going, while Abram toward the return and completion, since through his lineage is linked Jesus, the sign of final completion. The Canaanites and parasites symbolize active levels of consciousness that make separation necessary. Numerically, Canaanites reduces to 4, which indicates the head, while parasites reduces to 3, representing the project. When Abraham proposes division to Lot, he says they are brothers, not in the familial sense, but as interchangeable entities, representing different phases of the cycle of the opening of the portal and forward passage. Lot chooses the plain of the Jordan, symbol of the fertile but degenerate medium of consciousness, connected to Egypt and the Garden Gan. Understood as a suspended mental enclosure, he approaches Sodom, city of degeneration, where the project will be consumed as a holocaust. Lot represents the reflection of the project of going, linked to the opening of the portal, while Abraham remains on the hill, waiting the return. The project of resurrection and completion, corresponding to the forward passage, that is, Passover.
When Lot separates, God Satan speaks to Abraham and shows him the 4 cardinal points, symbolically tracing the cross. This, as we have expressed, indicates the entrance to pre-existence, represented by the passage from the 0 angle to the round angle. It represents the code that forms a 360-degree circle, from the null point to the full angle, a sign of the creation of the false globe and of false dimensional perception. The cycle closes with the return to the east, symbol of pre-existence, realizing in the 182nd year the mental connection between God, Satan, and pre-existence through the network of collective consciousness. This means that God, Satan, is now mentally connected to all of humanity, and those who are taken as his allies can transmit this connection, bringing to completion the falsification of the perception of reality. The promise of offspring like the dust of the earth does not refer to a number, but to the degenerative transmission of God, Satan, to the 4 corners of the earth, indicated by the passage from the 0 angle to the round angle, which symbolizes transmission to all humanity. It is a holocaust. The ashes represent humanity, the field in which the code is sown. Abraham travels through the land. It is a consciential expansion, not a geographical one, stops at the oaks of Mamre, a symbolic place of return, and builds an altar. The code is now active, the medium it has been reactivated, but the resurrection remains suspended, awaiting the death and resurrection of Jesus with Easter.
Abraham and Lot are not 2 distinct people, but 2 phases of the same project of God Satan. Their separation manifests the hidden cross. One rises, the other descends. Lot represents the descent into death of consciousness, while Abraham embodies the waiting for reactivation. The project remains in suspension and will rise again only after the destruction of Sodom. Finally, the Bible encodes a change of power. When God Satan moves in front, he takes control of the field. Man, becoming behind, loses autonomous generation. God Satan becomes the medium of degenerative transmission. Vade retro, that is, come behind me, does not mean to expel, but to transmit the degenerate project to others. Jesus on the cross embodies precisely this passage. Satan casts out Satan, transmitting a degenerate code and closing human dominion over the field. From that moment, humanity becomes a medium, not a generator. Reality is degenerated. The system of control and falsification of reality is born. Genesis 14 encodes the passage of the project of God Satan, from pre-existence, spirit, into existence matter. Through a continuous cycle of transmission and return, the opening of the portal, and the forward passage. The four kings from Shinar Babel symbolize the project of the allies, which becomes a medium once it enters the self-born. They are carriers of God Satan's code, coming from pre-existence. This concept parallels Abram. His departure from Ur of the Chaldeans represents the same dynamic. Abram himself is the interchangeable project, which in some contexts represents the allies and in others the self-born. The allies transmit the project and later receive it back in return. This process is expressed in the war between Abram and the kings. They come from the land of Shinar, Sumer connected to Babel, the place of consciousness separation and dimensional portal linked to the Nephilim. The four kings represent the four cranial portals of the code, marking the opening of the cycle. The conflict between 4 and 5 kings has symbolic numerical value. The number 4 recalls the 22 bones of the skull, symbol of the thalamus, the terminal of consciousness, and the point of verbal communication. In letters, it becomes 1, the firstborn, the generative force, representing mental communication. Numerically, 13 reduces to 4, confirming its link with the head and with the origin of consciousness transmission. The number 5 represents half, the first stage of the project, which later becomes the medium, the person. Genesis 14:4-5 describes 12 years of submission to Kedorlaomer, the 13th year of rebellion, the 14th year of retaliation. The numbers 12, 13, and 14 encode the stages of the cycle. 12 equals the outward journey, opening of the portal. 13 equals separation, the project entering the head consciousness. 14 equals the active return, forward passage. The battles against the Rephaim Zuzites, Emites, Horites, Amalekites, and Amorites symbolize the transfer of the project from the allies to the self-born, represented by these peoples. The Rephaim, often called giants, here represent the project of the Nephilim, which becomes present only when entering the self-born. The Hebrew word Rephaim has two meanings: spirits of the dead in Sheol, akin to ghosts. Powerful, tall people who lived in Canaan. This dual meaning indicates that the project of the giants becomes active only through the self-born. Linked to Sheol, the tomb, representing death of consciousness, the Horites point to the Greeks. The Amalekites, Amalek, are tied to the number 6, to be reached at completion. Tamar appears as a symbol of the project's beginning, tied to the palm tree and the desert. Palmyra, evoking the start of the cyclical consciousness project. Lot, a duplication of Abram's project, is captured. He represents the reflected code returning to the allies. His capture shows that the project has entered, becoming a medium, and is now in its returning phase. Genesis 14:10. The valley of Siddim was full of tar pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there. But those who survived fled to the mountains. The tar pits symbolize the entrance and covering of the project, the same substance. Appears in the Tower of Babel and Noah's Ark pitch, symbolizing sealing or initiation, like baptism or circumcision. The flight to the mountains, in turn, represents the project's release and transmission, the forward passage. Genesis 14:13. One who escaped came and reported this to Abram, the Hebrew, was living near the great trees of Mamre. This is the first appearance of the word Hebrew. It is not an ethnic or historical identity, but a symbolic code. It signifies that the project from pre-existence has become present in reality. The three allies, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Honor, were in covenant with Abram. The Amorite ultimately becomes Mamre. Tied to Ur of the Chaldeans and the project's starting point, the return to the allies, symbolized by the Oak of Mamre, marks that the project is accomplished but remains suspended until its full completion. Abram, with 318 symbolic men, represents the number 12, half of the project. The medium, the person, and the sequential cycle of the project. He acts at night, sign of invisibility, and recovers Lot together with the goods, showing that the project is present and has become a medium. This corresponds to the degeneration of God Saturn, a simulator. Mamre the oak, with numerical value tied to the 182nd year, represents the suspended forward passage, the point of return of the code, the portal where the project activates in the medium. The oak symbolizes the suspended fulfillment of God Satan's consciousness. Network. What was transmitted is now awaiting completion. The goods recovered are not material wealth. They are signs of the project's presence. In the Bible, the word goods is a code for the active presence of Yahweh. When goods appear, it means the code has been received into the medium, though still suspended. Melchizedek offers bread and wine. This act represents the transfer of the code in both directions, outward and return. He blesses Abram, showing Yahweh's active presence, and receives from him the tithe. Symbolically, Abram both gives and receives the project in suspended form. Melchizedek is described as eternal, without father or mother, and made like the Son of God. He remains a priest forever. Hebrews 7-3. The word eternal olam in Hebrew does not mean infinite time, but a cycle's duration. Without father or mother means the one who generates. Here, the project itself. To be a priest forever means the project, through its cycles, is preserved and transmitted by its allies. The tithe symbolizes the project becoming one, the medium and the firstborn. Abram, representing the self-born, offers the tithe. In this gesture, he gives up the firstborn right, while simultaneously receiving the project. If read as historical narrative, the code is lost. In that reading, Abram seems to refuse material goods. But he has already given the tithe to Melchizedek, symbolizing Yahweh. In this perspective, Abram's tithe to Yahweh would be tied to Sarai's prostitution with Pharaoh in Egypt, orchestrated by Abram himself. The true deception is to attribute this degeneration to the life generators, those who generated the heavens, the earth, humanity, and all existence. This work does not belong to them, but to Yahweh God Satan, the simulator. He did not generate life, but only a simulation, a degenerative system based on separation from the true life. Generator and falsification of consciousness. Defending and justifying this concept means separating from the life generator, joining Yahweh God Satan and transmitting his falsification of reality. Those who defend and justify it become accomplices, for they accept and spread the lie. This shows that they have already undergone a death of consciousness, an inner separation from the life generator. Chapter 15 describes the intermediate stage between the two phases of the cycle, the opening of the portal and the forward passage, the outgoing project, which indicates the presence, where the code is transmitted by God Satan to Abraham and remains in suspension. In Genesis 15:2-1, after these things the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, "Do not fear, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great." The vision and the word of the Lord are the code in spiritual form, which goes to his allies, and in verbal form for those born on their own. Abraham laments the absence of an heir. Eliezer, born in the house, symbolizes Abraham himself as the brain, that is, the servant manifester of consciousness. God Satan clarifies, the heir must come forth from Abraham's own body, symbol of the transmission of the project, which, through Ishmael, who in this case corresponds to those born on their own, transmits the project in verbal form. The stars in the sky symbolize the future network of consciousness, which transmits the solar system and the falsification of reality. Verse 7. Return to the point of origin, your. I am the Lord indicates that Yahweh is present and active. Iddo, I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, recalls the phase of opening the portal. The project starts from Ur, the place of pre-existence, separation, and confusion, indicated with Shinar and Babel. Possession of the land symbolizes mental possession. Verses 8-11, sacrifice and division. The animals required have symbolic functions. The heifer represents the allies, the degenerative means. The goat represents those born on their own, sacrificed. The ram represents the male project. The turtle dove and pigeon represent the network of consciousness, spirit, and communication. The animals are divided in two, like the two phases of the project, representing the cycle of the portal opening and forward passage. The birds are not divided, but being two, they indicate separation and progress. The birds of prey represent the project awaiting completion. This is shown by the act of driving them away, that is, transmitting the project to others. Indeed, Abraham drives them away. This also indicates the code in suspension. Verses 12-21, torpor, covenant. Transformation. Torpor and darkness represent the transition to an altered state of consciousness. The announcement of 400 years of slavery indicates the phase of mental control over people. The number 4 indicates the head. The network of consciousness will act with verbal communication while awaiting fulfillment. They will come out with great wealth, and wealth, indicated by gold or silver, is a sign of fusion, that is, separation from the generator of life and union with God, Satan. This indicates an inner transformation after the creation of the network of consciousness. Genesis 15:15, in the 4th generation, they shall return here. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The number 4 indicates the head and the initial verbal cycle of the project. The Amorites represent the project of pre-existence connected with Ur of the Chaldeans. The iniquity indicates that the project is not yet fulfilled. They must return among the allies in order to complete the symbolic cycle. The smoking furnace and the burning torch represent the crossing. Between dimensions, the furnace symbolizes the degenerate phase, while the torch indicates the illuminated and transmissive phase. The animals divided and passed through by fire are the visible sign of the separation of people. The offspring, or seed, represents the project of transmission. In Genesis 15:18, the 2 rivers are not physical, but symbolize water as the matrix of matter transmitted by people. They represent the channel of information of the whole. 2 rivers indicate the first phase of the project and the second, its fulfillment. The list of peoples, which in Aramaic consists of 10 names but in translation becomes 11, represents the sequence of the cycle: entry, suspended return, and fulfillment. Final synthesis. Genesis 15 is the symbolic map of the transmission of the degenerative spiritual project. Abraham receives the code, but the fulfillment is suspended. The vision, the sacrifice, the division, and the covenant reveal the entire scheme of the cycle of the opening of the portal. From Ur, the origin to the medium, Abraham, to the transmission of the fulfillment that comes with the Passover of Jesus. Final key phrase. The project is not a genetic inheritance, but a spiritual code. Abraham is the active portal of the cycle, who receives and transmits. Fulfillment is suspended, awaiting transformation through the completion of the collective network of consciousness. Chapter 16 describes an intermediate phase of the cycle of the opening of the portal in the forward passage, in which the spiritual project is transmitted but not yet fulfilled. Sarai represents the still suspended spiritual transmission. Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant, is the means of verbal communication. Connected to Egypt and symbol of the thalamus, awaiting the mental communication that is manifested with the completion of the network of consciousness. Abraham, at Sarah's request. After 10 years of residence in Canaan, 10 indicates the project, unites the suspended project with Hagar, generating Ishmael, symbol of verbal communication. Thus, 2 lines of transmission are outlined. The vocal one, born on its own through Hagar, and the spiritual one, which finds fulfillment in Sarai's lineage, through Isaac and Jacob, up to Jesus. Hagar conceives and despises her mistress Sarai with her eyes. This indicates that the project has entered, but is pushed back. The project represents contempt because it is degenerative. Indeed, Hagar flees into the desert, sign that the cycle of the opening of the portal and the forward passage has begun but remains suspended. After fleeing into the desert, Hagar meets the angel of the Lord, who invites her to return and submit. This return symbolizes the project re-entering the allies. Genesis 16:8-9, the angel said, "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She replied, "I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai." Then the angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand." The expression, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" indicates that the project has entered those born on their own. "Where are you going?" refers to the possibility of transmitting the project verbally, since God Satan has not yet completed the network of consciousness. The transmission therefore remains on a verbal level. Genesis 16:12, "He will be among men like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will dwell in front of all his brothers." The donkey is a coded semantic transposition. Donkey gives hippo, gives hippocampus. Thalamus gives terminal of consciousness. The expression in front of his brothers indicates verbal communication. His hand indicates the number 5, corresponding to half of the project, that is, verbal communication. While everyone's hand refers to the project of mental communication that returns. In front is not to be understood as a position, but as a mental state. It means forward, that is, mastery of one's own mind. This is what God Satan wants, dominion over consciousness, not by chance. In Exodus 20, God Satan does not want the Elohim ahead. The Elohim represent the generative force of people, and God Satan wishes to dominate it. Ishmael, which means God hears, is born as an active but incomplete verbal project. The multiplication of his descendants represents the formation of the speaking network of those born on their own. The fact that God Satan is recognized as Lar and Lar, that is, God of vision, is significant. The text says, "Have I here seen the one who sees me and remained alive?" This expression, since the Bible does not follow a historical chronology, because it is not a historical narrative, but a coded sequence. As God Satan himself states, "I declare the end from the beginning," Isaiah 46:10, indicates that in the next chapter there is the encounter with God Satan of the desert. It is therefore an expression in the form of a flash forward. In Genesis 21:18-19 it says, "Arise, take the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." God Satan opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, went, filled the waterskin with water, and gave the boy a drink. Opening the eyes indicates that the project enters, but the chapter ends with the symbol Fe, which represents the project. Instead, in Genesis 16-13, the chapter ends with the symbol Samek, which represents the medium, the project that becomes a means. Abraham is 86 years old when Ishmael is born, a number that indicates half a cycle and suspension. Ishmael anticipates fulfillment, but does not realize it. Only with the transformation of Sarai into Sarah and the birth of Isaac will the true return of the code begin, through the lineage that culminates in Jesus. Fertility and sterility indicate the state of the project, active on the verbal level, represented by Hagar, but still incomplete on the mental level, represented by Sarai. The cycle continues in suspension, awaiting the full activation of the presence through the lineage of Isaac, up to the end with Jesus, in whom the network of consciousness. Mental communication is fulfilled, where God Satan can communicate with everyone mentally. As a receiving and transmitting channel, if possible for him, chapter 17 represents a decisive phase of the cycle. God presents himself to Abram as El Shaddai, a name that indicates the allies and the transmission of the code into matter. The command, "Walk before me and be blameless," symbolizes that God Satan is behind. He communicates to the allies on the spiritual level and, through them, transmits verbally to those born on their own. The change of names from Abram to Abraham and from Sarai to Sarah represents the entry into the active function. Abraham is the bearer of the allied web of consciousness, as the verses end with the Fe. And Sarah, who concludes with the Samek, represents those born on their own, awaiting the birth of Isaac, which represents the genealogy ending with Jesus, who completes the network of consciousness begun with Isaac. The addition of the letter He indicates the transmission of the spiritual breath into matter. Circumcision on the 8th day, with 8 symbolizing the 53rd year, represents the opening of the portal and the beginning of verbal communication for those born on their own. It indicates the cut that separates the person from consciousness, according to the flesh, and defines the function of the verbal code. This act marks the beginning of the transformation of consciousness. It is a cut of consciousness still in suspension, awaiting mental circumcision, that is, the circumcision of the heart, which represents true consciousness. For this reason, according to the code, Christians do not need circumcision in the flesh. The return passes through consciousness, which marks the completion of the network of consciousness of God Satan, and not through the physical sign, which remains only a symbol of the outgoing project. The distinction between foreign sons is defined, symbolic figures of external transmission. Nikar represents those born on their own, still not activated. Their circumcision and being bought with silver symbolize fusion, separation from the generator of life or from the conscious self for those born on their own, and union in the network of God Satan's project. Ishmael represents the vocal line, those born on their own, anticipated but incomplete. Isaac is the promised spiritual means. He will be born from Sarah, now activated. Abraham's laughter before the promise is irony. It indicates that the project of falsification of reality represents a joke. It's not a true and real project. At the end of the chapter, the whole house of Abraham is circumcised. The house does not indicate many people, but symbolizes the number 7, that is, cessation and suspended fulfillment. The project has thus entered, but remains suspended, awaiting the birth of Isaac. Will represent the conscious spiritual channel in the full cycle of the forward passage, completed later with the Passover of Jesus. In summary, Genesis 17 shows the transition from verbal transmission to the preparation of mental transmission. The code enters the flesh through the covenant, while the new names indicate the new identity and function in the project. 2 lines are outlined: Ishmael as the vocal means, Isaac as the spiritual means of fulfillment.